Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have something a little special for you. We're going to sort of rewind and talk about the Hour of History project and look back to how far we've come and also sort of talk about what's in the future. So the last episode I talked with Ali Straub about the Camino de Santiago. We talked about that. It was very interesting to hear her stories, her personal experiences. We didn't get too deep into the history of the Camino. And we did this for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm going to be gone for a week walking the Camino Ingles myself. And two, because it's just so good to hear the personal stories. So I've invited Ali back, and in a week after I return, we're going to be talking about the Camino again. We'll probably add a little more history, and I'll get to share my experiences from the Camino Ingles. So we hope you will join us for that. Now, in addition to that, this week we're going to do a look back at sort of the St. Patrick's Day episode, which was the first episode of Hour of History. It was a project, this Hour of History podcast, that was born out of conversation between me and James. We were friends from our study abroad, and we wanted to create this sort of project that could introduce general audiences to a wide range of historical topics. So we could educate people, we could inspire people, we could spark a curiosity, create a conversation that's necessary for any sort of historical conversation in the modern age. And it started from literally nothing. We knew that we liked to listen to podcasts. James is talented with computers, and I study and read a lot of books. And that was about it. And I think we've grown a lot in a year, and I think you can really tell by listening to Hour of History. So please go back to old episodes, check out the progress that we've sort of made. There might be topics that you missed or segments that you missed. We added Matthias on in the fall, and his addition has certainly been good to the Hour of History project. We're going to continue to put out one episode every week. I'm going to continue my narrative cities, Hour of History cities project, and we're also going to keep inviting guests like Jeffrey Cobb, who wrote The Rise of the Sugar King, and we'll continually try to improve the quality of the podcast. So not only can you continue to enjoy it as a listener, but you can tell other people, hey, I'm listening to a great history podcast. It talks about current events. It talks about the past. It's not just a long narrative. It's not just someone talking at you, but it's a conversation. And I think that's very important. I think historians need it. I think the academy needs it. I think it might be something that saves history in colleges and helps history grow in schools. So if you know teachers, if you know any interested people that just want to be part of the world and be a little more educated, a little more inspired about it, please do tell them about Hour of History podcast. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, on Google Play, on iTunes, on Stitcher. We're on all of the formats. It's very easy to download our podcasts, and we really do appreciate any feedback, any comments, and any listeners. So thank you so much. Enjoy this look back at St. Patrick's Day. Have a great St. Patrick's Day, and I'll see you in a couple weeks after I've walked the Camino. Welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman.
And I'm your producer, James Abel.
All right, great. It's good to be with you, James, and I'm excited about getting this podcast on the road. I've wanted to do a podcast for a very long time because I think now is a time where history is very important. And I think people are looking for the past, and people are looking for ways to interpret the past and how to understand the past.
Well, how about for our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you come from?
Yeah. That is a good idea. How rude of me not to introduce myself. I'm currently a PhD student at Temple University. Philadelphia is not my original hometown. I come from California via Louisiana, New York, Korea, China. I've been to a lot of places, and throughout I've always had an appreciation for the history and the stories that make up the place. So through college, I got my undergrad degree in history. I got a master's in history and a master's in education. And now I'm going for the doctorate and trying to expand the ways in which we spread historical knowledge to people.
What gave you the idea to do the podcast?
I personally listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and I think it's a great way for people who don't have a lot of time or want to have a voice in the background or just need another way to access knowledge other than the written word. The podcast is an extraordinary opportunity for that, and it's something that we have now that can be accessed all over the world. And plus, it's like the blog of today. Everyone's starting one. One of the biggest things, and I teach at community colleges, one of the biggest things with these community college students is that they're really eager to learn and they want to get their degree done. But many of them are commuting long distances, working 2 jobs, doing tons of work that takes time where they can't be sitting with a book, with a notebook, taking notes on the literature that they read. Now, they might be on a train, they might be able to listen for 30 minutes, or they might be in a car in a commute and just... it's another way to sort of get the knowledge out there, and I'm really excited about it, actually.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, let me just mention a few things about myself. I'm just kind of here to help you do your thing. And so for the listeners, I'll just be kind of chiming in and getting you to maybe explain some things in some more plain language. I'm not a history buff by any means, and but I'm just... I like the idea of the podcast and love chatting with you, so that'll be my place. So every once in a while, listeners, you'll hear me chime in and ask questions or throw my 2 cents in about something. And I'm also here to learn. So what do we got going today?
We've got an exciting show for you here today. This is thematically appropriate as we are just now 11 days away from St. Patrick's Day. This podcast is entitled Beer into Water. It is sort of a symbolic of the deconstruction we're going to do, both the deconstruction just for understanding and for curiosity's sake about St. Patrick. So St. Patrick begins his confession, one of only 2 documents we have from the actual St. Patrick. He begins, "I am Patrick, a sinner, and a very unsophisticated man. I am the least of all the faithful, and to many the most despised." Now, that's just a very short first opening line of one of, like I said, 2 documents that we have of this St. Patrick, who's about to be commemorated in a great way, in a great celebration, really in a celebration that's grown to be all over the world. So the sort of thematic guiding question, and historians always have questions, the guiding question we're going to have today is who is St. Patrick, and why does he get a day? Not a lot of people get days, whether it is for secular or religious holidays. The Catholic Church has a great tradition of honoring saints on saint days, but I don't know anyone who goes out into the streets and drinks green beer on St. Stephen's Day. But St. Patrick's Day has this cultural celebration that has made it grow into a massive event. And I want to understand who is St. Patrick and why does he get a day. So knowing questions that you want to ask and not just knowing about the past, this is exactly what historians are. So a lot of people have the misconception from school or from textbooks that historians are just people who memorize dates and memorize events. Well, that's not how it starts. What happens is a historian might come across a day like St. Patrick's Day and ask questions. It's really about curiosity. So throughout this show, I want you to be curious. James and I are always welcoming questions and concerns you have. And so if you hear something that's wrong, if you hear something that doesn't make sense, or if you're just curious to learn more, please feel free to ask us. So now the framework to understand any historical question is important. How do you approach your historical question? And I've borrowed a framework from Professor Howard Spodek at Temple University, a professor who's worked with Philadelphia city schools, with high schools, with college level he's taught for many years, he breaks it down into three things. He starts with what do we already know? Then he moves to how do we know it? And last, we have a discussion. What difference does it make? Why is what we know important? Now, if you're journalistic in your background, you might recognize this as the who, what, where, when, why. But it's more simple. What do we know? How do we know it? What difference does it make? So what do we know about Patrick? He starts his confession with this very, I am a sinner. Something you might expect from someone back where Patrick was from. So let's give you the information. Patrick is born in 387. The traditional dates given are 387 to 461. Now, any 5th century history becomes very challenging because there's not a huge amount of sources surviving. First of all, the document has to survive until now. Secondly, it has to be preserved and it has to be understood. So there's a lot of challenges. In the case of Patrick, he wrote down 2 documents. He wrote down a confession, the one I started the story with, and a letter to soldiers in Britain. Now, why would Patrick write letters to soldiers in Britain? It goes back to where Patrick comes from. And now this is a great one that will stump anyone at the bar you go to on St. Patrick's Day. Ask them, where is St. Patrick from? Aha! Some of you say, oh, Stephen, come on. I already knew that. St. Patrick's not from Ireland. But not a lot of people really know that.
He isn't?
There you go. I already... Yeah, and
you got one.
It didn't earn me a Guinness tonight, but it just might on March 17th. So, Patrick is born Patricius. He's born in the far outer ranges of the Roman Empire. Now, by the 5th century, the Roman Empire was a Christian empire, and Patrick was born to a deacon in what is now, today, known as the United Kingdom, but was then just the British Britannia. The language Patrick writes in is a very vulgar Latin. He writes almost as if someone who would speak Latin, but maybe have to learn it as a second language, because he was a Roman citizen. So Patrick is born. He's born in a colony of Rome. He's Christian. He's religious. His father is religious, and so he has this passed down to him. But before he can become an adult, he's kidnapped. As the story goes, he's kidnapped by pirates, and he's taken across the Irish Sea. He's taken to what we now know as Ireland today, and he becomes a slave. He's sold into slavery. Now, according to the story, Patrick is living his life as a slave. This is 5th century Ireland, so you really have to put yourself in that situation. There's not a whole lot happening. There's different pockets of different tribes, warlords. The religion is Druidism. We don't know too much other than that, but Patrick's in a place where he likely doesn't speak the language, where he's forced to do labor, and he has a lot of time to pray. So Patrick begins to get these visions, and in one of the visions, he's told that he needs to escape. So the story goes, he walks 200 miles across the distance of Ireland, and he finds a return back to Britain. Now, his story doesn't end after he returns, because Patrick is a pious, good, like you might expect, 5th century Roman citizen of a privileged background to be. So he joins the priesthood, and he finds his mission is to return to Ireland and to convert the native population to the Christianity that he grew up believing. So Patrick goes back to Ireland, and he begins to convert people, and these are all pieces of information we know from the two documents that Patrick left us with.
I noticed at least a couple points there you were saying as the story goes. Is that some of this kind of how much of this is kind of assumed to be folklore and how much of it is kind of assumed to be accurate?
Right. So it's a really interesting. Now, Patrick, he's at the very far out reaches of the Roman Empire. Now, we have a lot of documents from the top level Romans around the 5th century. We don't have anything, almost anything from Britain, except for Patrick's letters. So very few documents have survived, and over time, what happens is the story grows. There's one famous historian even has a theory that there were two Patricks. One was Patricus and one was Palladius. So there's a whole lot of area for speculation. In fact, the problem with these ancient sources is you don't necessarily have to footnote them or reference them to bolster up your imagination. You sort of create your own justification for why things happen. So more and more people start writing about Patrick as time goes on. There's very famous documents around the 7th century, 8th century, and so on. And then all the way up to the 19th and 20th century, it eventually becomes its own study, like Patrickology, to find out what happened and what didn't. So historians have had these questions for a long time. But the only things that we can focus on really as evidence are his two letters.
I'm kind of wondering how much has been inserted into the story of St. Patrick.
Right,
over time.
And not only inserted, but also interpreted. So we're talking about a Latin that is not the standard Latin that even a medievalist historian would learn, but a Latin that is spoken by a region of the Roman Empire that is quite far from Rome itself. So, almost its own dialect. So let me read you a little passage here, just so you can get a taste of the confession of what historians work with. So now this has been translated from Latin to English, and another thing we'll do is include the source material on the website, so you can look that up. So he writes, 3 days later, we landed on the coast and wandered through an empty region for 28 days. They had no food and were starving. So the next day the captain said to me, "Christian, what do you have to say? You claim your God is great and all-powerful. Why then are you unable to pray for us? We are worn down by hunger, and it's not likely we will ever see living souls again." But confidently, I, Patrick is writing, said to them, "Turn your hearts to faith, to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible to him. For his abundance, he may send food to you this very day on your journey, that you will be satisfied." And with God's help, that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, a herd of pigs appeared before us on the road. They killed many of them, and their hunger was satisfied. And so on. And this is Patrick explaining how he got people to convert to Christianity in his confessions. So that's one perspective, one document, and that might be very much what you expect a religious adherent to say at that time period. So the confession is not too surprising. Now, in another writing, his other writing is, in my opinion, a little more interesting. It gives you a little more insight into Patrick's sort of struggle that he's facing in this Roman world, and he starts this one with the same sort of intro. "I'm Patrick. I'm a sinner and a very ignorant man. I declare that I've been appointed as bishop in Ireland, and I believe I have received this position from God himself." Now, this is a letter to the soldiers of Caroticus. Now, Caroticus was a warlord in Britain at the time. And Patrick writes about Caroticus, "As for Caroticus and his band of most evil criminals and rebels against Christ, where will they find themselves? They have distributed baptized Christian women as prizes, all for the sake of this fleeting world that will vanish in a moment. Like a cloud of smoke blown away by the wind, so these lying sinners will disappear from the sight of God. but the righteous will feast in the great happiness of Christ. They will judge the nations and rule over the wicked kings forever and ever. So in this one, he's really explaining his frustration at Caradocus, who was this warlord who goes over to Ireland and allegedly slaughters most of Patrick's converts. So we don't have a whole lot of information. Between those two letters, not a whole lot of information on Patrick. But from that has grown this amazing legend. And this is a quote from E.A. Thompson's book, Who Was St. Patrick? He writes, Father John Ryan, S.J., wrote, Patrick died in what was almost a blaze of glory and lived on in the popular memory as a great national figure, a worthy companion of heroes and kings. And E.A. Thompson responds to this, no doubt it ought to have been so, but as a matter of fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Not a single writer mentions him until the 7th century. And then he goes on to say that, this sort of thing happened where people would go over to Ireland, attempt to convert the pagans and die or come back or stay there and never return. So there's a lot of space for Patrick to be imagined. And part of that imagination happens in the 7th century when Ireland becomes more Christian. And Muirachú, an Irish bishop in the 7th century, writes a book called The Life of St. Patrick. And it's a hagiography. So it's writing laudatory things about St. Patrick, and it almost always follows the typical biblical story. And this is where you get a lot of the magical Patrick with his staff that can chase snakes away, and with the idea of the shamrock, the 3-leaf clover being used to teach the Trinity. So from these buildings, we have the growth of the myth of St. Patrick, and he sort of becomes this exceptional figure. It really translates into the images and iconography that you might expect from Christianity. And if you look at a picture now of St. Patrick, you might see him holding a staff with snakes at his feet, driving the snakes away. And, the staff reminiscent of, say, Moses and Pharaoh, and his outfit with the long white beard and the halo.
I have not seen that, but that would be something that we could throw up on the episode notes, because I do want to check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some great public domain images that show sort of the progression of St. Patrick's image. St. Patrick, in his 2 documents, never claims to drive any snakes away or use any shamrocks or convert the entire island. Just says he's a missionary. He says he's going to convert people, and he that's basically where he leaves it at. The rest is filled in later.
And I bet you're getting there, but maybe it's the beer lover in me. How does the beer into water tie into all this?
So it's kind of funny, but the same branch of bishops in the 7th century who are working from Ireland, creating this wonderful tradition of Irish saints, work not only on St. Patrick, but also on St. Brendan and St. Bridget. And the stories of St. Brendan and St. Bridget, really, they're very similar to the life of St. Patrick in that they follow a very typical biblical retelling. So one of the stories of the life of St. Bridget is where she turns water into beer. And this is the story. Another miracle performed by worthy Bridget was this. Lepers came asking for beer, although she had none to give. But seeing water prepared for baths, she blessed it, and with the power of faith, it turned into the finest beer. She then drew it out in abundance for thirsty lepers. So, yes, so you have all the classical tropes there, right?
Yeah, of all the magical powers, that's got to be up there on my list of ones that I want to get.
and clearly it's somehow I guess you could say it's, Bridget did it there for the lepers, but St. Patrick has really done it for the Irish, as one can only guess or how much Guinness will be sold in 10 days. So you see this growth, and we're talking an enormous amount of time. And the way I always sort of explained it to my students when we were dealing with more ancient stuff, especially the younger students, is if Patrick's in the 5th century, we can say century, but just think 100 years is a very long life. That's 15 very long lives ago that Patrick was living. So this is a very, very long time ago. Even the 7th century, when the first stories of these saints come out, it's an extremely long time ago. It's not until much later that Patrick becomes recognized as because the sainthood used to be just sort of a local thing, and it doesn't become institutionalized until much later, and it certainly becomes an Ireland type of point of pride, and then it folds itself into a whole web of complex, different routes history takes. So there's an enormous amount of threads that this story has that goes in almost as many ways or more ways than the Irish people themselves do. So, St. Patrick and his story continues to be reproduced and relived and used for various purposes. And that's one of the reasons it's so important to study history, is because people take these symbols and they take these stories and then they use them for their purposes. So it's important for you to sort of be able to trace it and understand it. Take, for example, the flag of the United Kingdom. It features the cross of St. Patrick. So
is that right?
Part of having Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland is still today, right? The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the symbol at that time used for Ireland was the what we might say the red cross in the shape of an X over a white field. That's the St. Patrick's flag. So that's folded in addition to the cross of St. George, which is the red cross on a white field, and the cross of St. Andrew, which is the white X on the blue field. So these symbols are embedded. Say in the flag of Montreal, the Canadian city, in the bottom right corner is the shamrock, which is the 3-leaf clover. Yet when you go inevitably to these St. Patrick's Day marches, it's always the 4-leaf clover, and the luck of the Irish, blah blah blah. But the story with St. Patrick is that he used a shamrock, which is a 3-leaf clover, which goes with the Trinity in the Christian story, or even the Roman story in the dog that guards hell. And I'm not too up on Roman, so I'm sure we'll have people.
So where did the 4-leaf clover kind of start to take significance and come into play?
See, I don't know. That's a good question. I was looking at early postcards from early St. Patrick's Day celebrations, like, say, back in the 1900s, 1800s, and there's still shamrocks in those symbols. So, but Glasgow Celtic football team, which founded in 1888, they used the 4-leaf clover rather than the shamrock. So I don't know. That's a good question that a historian might ask and research. Yeah, so you have changes, and that's part of why, why is St. Patrick's Day, it's a festival, right, where people wear green. But the original color of St. Patrick, St. Patrick's cross is red, yes, but the earliest association I've seen of him with a color is blue. And I don't know, I'm not sure why, but even Ireland, when it first gets its independence or pseudo-independence or almost independence, when it becomes the Irish Free State, its flag is blue with a harp on it. The color is blue. And even you can see remnants of that still today. The Northern Irish football team wears blue shirts or green shirts with blue trim. So when these things switch over and when green becomes the identity of St. Patrick's in Ireland, there's a certain point where all of this happens.
Green being associated with St. Patrick has everything to do with that Ireland has green in its flag and some other parts of its symbolism.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. It has to do more so with the Irish Republic's flag having green, and
okay,
so the first St. Patrick's Day. Now St. Patrick's Day was a religious holiday, that's for sure. It was a holy day of obligation in Ireland, where you would have to go to church on St. Patrick's Day. But in the United States, it became a cultural celebration. So even before there's the United States, back when it's still the colonies, there are St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Boston, in New York, and Philadelphia, and not necessarily parades. This is just Irish people getting together to A, have community, and B, celebrate something part of their community. So that's where you start, I think, to see a lot of changes in the imagery, the storytelling, the growth of the Irish identity abroad. And there are different growths and different changes and permutations with the Irish communities all over.
And yeah, I think with so many holidays in America, I kind of guess that it has to do a lot with our multiculturalism, is that they become very secular and very kind of, we get tied up in the rituals that we perform every time the holiday comes around, and we kind of, we lose a bit of the history. So it's, to kind of give kudos to you for choosing this topic. It's nice to get a little background on why we have these holidays.
Right, and it's really sort of remarkable how St. Patrick's Day has sort of seamlessly almost made that transition from a religious holiday to a secular holiday. I would hazard a guess that most, while the, say, New York parade, it does still start at St. Patrick's Cathedral, I would hazard a guess that most marching in the parade aren't going to church. I mean, I have no data to back that claim up, but it's certainly those down in Lower Manhattan that are the Lower East Side are not celebrating it for religious reasons, from what I've seen. So yeah, we've talked sort of about what we know, the story of Patrick, and it's a great story, and there's resources all over that can kind of give you more depth on that story. We've talked a little bit about how we know it, a couple letters that Patrick left behind that have been translated and debated about, and historians have dedicated their entire life to analyzing those letters, and we just touched briefly on them. I gave you some short snippets to give you a taste. And then the last part always that we're trying to understand is what difference does it make? And we've talked a little bit about how this figure can be used for various people, how it still has a big cultural impact, and how it's sort of a spreading of culture. So it starts with Patrick spreading culture from Christian Roman Empire to the Druids in Ireland, and culture being spread back too. Of all signs of Patrick's story show that he wanted to go back to Ireland. That means that there must have been something there that was desirable for him. I highly doubt that his mission was to go back to a place that he didn't like at all, to convert people that he didn't like at all. Rather, I would think a concerned Patrick would be going back to Ireland to help convert these people that he grew fond of when he was over there. or at least grew concerned for. So you see these cross-cultural currents are just going back and forth, and they continue to do so as we prepare to celebrate or prepare to not celebrate. Even not celebrating is an act in its own on this cultural story that will continue to go based on the way you interact with it. And that's sort of why it's important to bring an understanding, and also why it's important to continue to question these things. So when you see Chicago turn its river green again this year, it's more meaningful to you. Or if it's not more meaningful to you, at least it's more interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to get some context on what's going on during these holidays.
Right, and then you also get the final thing, you sort of get an understanding of both the freedom and danger of using history the way you like. So St. Patrick, he goes back to a time when there was not a united kingdom, right? It was the Roman Empire, and there was no Ireland at that time. Yet, as you go on, and as these national identities become more firmly ingrained in the individuals, St. Patrick becomes sort of both a ground that could be fought over and something that can unify people. In fact, the first immigrants to begin these St. Patrick's Day celebrations were Protestants. Were not even Catholics. In Boston, and dating back to the 1700s, it's much more likely, if not certain, that they were Protestants in the United States. And then, so even that doesn't necessarily...
Yeah, I kind of want to ask. I was kind of wondering, so are there kind of non-Christian majority countries that celebrate St. Patrick's?
Well, that's a good question. It's a good historical question, and then you'd have to ask why. Why would they? Yeah, well, I just kind of touching back on how secular it's gotten in America, and then I kind of wondered if from there it spread to other countries as a kind of secular holiday, the way that kind of Halloween has and Christmas has. I know here in Vietnam they celebrate Halloween, come more and more every year, and probably most have little idea why, as many, maybe even Americans, myself to some degree included. But yeah, I know that after it becomes, kind of secularized to some degree, it can easily spread just because of the fun of participating in it, and the little things you do, especially for the kids on these holidays, and for the kids and the adults, right? Especially on a holiday like St. Patty's. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's a good question, and a good that could be a foundational study that you could do is where is St. Patrick's Day celebrated, how is it celebrated, and why is it celebrated? You have three very rich questions from which you can begin to understand people who celebrate it as well. Thanks for joining us for that look back at St. Patrick. It's been a pleasure to be a host here at hourofhistory.com. It's been a pleasure to work with James, pleasure to work with Matthias, and great to bring history back to you. Keep an eye out on hourofhistory.com. We have a lot of exciting things starting in the future. We're going to continue upgrading our product. We're going to continue making our sound better. We're going to make our content better, and we're going to produce more content because history is important. People want history, and I think people want conversations, and we certainly provide those things at Hour of History. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Hour of History.